Welcome. You remember the stories, don't you? The small pink dog, the comical shrieks, the silly rubber mask monsters visiting a little farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. You laughed. But the truth, the one buried beneath the brightly colored animation, is not a comedy. It is a record of trauma, a sanitized allegory for a suffering that was all too real. Nowhere was never a whimsical name. It is a literal descriptor. It is a scar on the map, a purgatorial sinkhole where the fabric of reality is thin, decaying, and deeply, deeply hungry. The stories weren't about a dog. They were the fragmented, terrified testimony of the last soul it consumed. Her name was Muriel Bagay, and she was the last one. Her existence was defined by a profound pathological loneliness, a chasm so deep she tried to fill it with sugar, flour, and tea. You must understand, her kindness was not a virtue. It was a shield. Her compulsive domesticity was a ritualistic ward, a desperate, repetitive prayer against the encroaching chaos she refused to see. She baked and cleaned and offered hospitality because to do otherwise would be to acknowledge the malice just outside her window. She had to believe the horrors at her door were just guests in need because the alternative, accepting she was already trapped, was a truth her mind could not afford to hold. The farmhouse itself was a tomb waiting to be filled. The air inside never truly changed. It held the thick, cloying scent of ozone, damp soil, and something sour, like spoiled milk left in the sun. Outside, the wind was a constant, oppressive presence. It wasn't a breeze, it was a voice, 1,000 distorted whispers carrying half-remembered conversations just below the threshold of hearing. The horizon was an unnaturally straight line, a surgical cut against a sickly, purple-red sunset, and the shadows in the corners of her kitchen by the rocking chair, they stretched and pooled, moving with a slow, liquid intelligence just at the edge of her vision. This was her world. This was her prison. And then there was Eustace, her husband. He was her anchor, but he was also her first and greatest failure of perception. He sat in his chair, a dry, flaking husk of a man animated by memory rather than life. He had been gone for years, hollowed out by the land, his insides replaced by dust and dry leaves. Yet Muriel served him. She spoke to him, chided him, poured him tea that grew cold and thick on the side table. His silence she interpreted as stoicism, his stillness as fatigue. His occasional guttural utterances, warnings like "leave it be" or "go away," were not directed at her but at the world. He was the land's first trophy, a scarecrow bound to the property. The end began with the storm, not rain, but dirt, a boiling vertical wall of reddish-brown grit that engulfed the farm, screaming like a billion insects. It lasted for an hour, plunging the world into a choking ochre darkness. When the wind finally receded, he was there, a desiccated, shrouded figure, impossibly still in the middle of the yard, holding a thin slab of dark stone, King Ramses. Muriel, seeing only a poor, lost man, felt the familiar, terrible pull of her compulsion. Ignoring the dry, rattling no that escaped Eustace's cracked lips, she unlatched the screen door. She smiled, she offered tea, and she willingly, foolishly, invited the curse over her threshold. The guest did not walk, it glided. The threshold was a barrier it did not acknowledge, passing over it as if it were a shadow, bringing with it a profound, suffocating absence of sound. The constant shriek of the wind died. The house sounds, the creaking boards, the ticking clock, were strangled into silence. Muriel's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in a soundless void. The figure stopped in the center of her parlor, a dry, shrouded monument of death, its presence radiating a cold that sunk straight into her bones, a cold that felt like the bottom of a well. It did not look at her, it simply was. Her compulsion took over, a desperate automated script against the terror. Would you like some tea?" she whispered, the words sounding alien and foolish in the oppressive quiet. She turned to the kitchen, her hand shaking so violently she could barely grip the kettle. The entity remained perfectly still, its back to her. The stone slab it held was covered in glyphs that seemed to writhe, tricking the eye. She turned her back on it, focusing on the ritual of boiling water, the lighting of the gas flame. It was the only way to pretend this was normal, to maintain the fragile veneer of her world. But the house was already reacting. The water in the kettle took an agonizingly long time to boil, the flame sputtering a sickly green. A wave of profound wet decay wafted from the pantry. She opened it, and a bag of potatoes fresh that morning had collapsed into a black, simmering liquid. A cloud of fruit flies rose from the sugar bowl, thick and choking. The smell. It was the smell of the grave, of forgotten things, and it was filling her home, her sanctuary. She slammed the pantry door, her breath hitching, but the stench was already loose, clinging to the air. And then the sound began, not from the creature, but from the air itself. "Return the slab." It was a whisper, a dry, sandy rasp that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the floorboards, from the ceiling plaster, from the static crackle of the AM radio. "Return the slab, or suffer my curse." It wasn't a demand, it was a statement of fact, a hollow, echoing prophecy that resonated in her teeth. Eustace, in his chair, began to rock, a fast, frantic, terrified motion, his heels drumming a panicked rhythm on the floor. Muriel, in her boundless, tragic denial, spun on him. "Stop it, Eustace! You're scaring our guest!" she snapped, her voice a thin, brittle thing. The guest remained unmoving. The curse was not a guest. The curse was a virus, and she had just unlocked the door. She turned, kettle in hand, and saw the first line of black, glistening beetles emerging from beneath the parlor rug, marching in a perfect, unnatural line toward the shrouded figure. She dropped the kettle, scalding water splashing across the linoleum. The sound of the splash instantly devoured by the silence. The rot accelerated with terrifying speed. The second curse. The house began to die around her. The wallpaper, patterned with cheerful, faded roses, began to peel away in wet, sloughing sheets, revealing walls beneath that were slick with a black, fungal growth. The smell of mold and spoiled milk became an aggressive physical presence. The beetles were joined by locusts, their bodies brittle and dry, which clung to the curtains, their collective rasping breath a new layer in the soundscape of her unraveling world. Her home was becoming a charnel house, and the guest stood at its center, a silent, patient conductor. She ran to the kitchen sink, retching, the taste of fear, acrid and metallic in her mouth. The water from the tap ran thick and brown, crawling with pale, thread-like worms. She screamed a raw, desperate sound and scrubbed at her counters, but the decay was faster. A loaf of bread on the counter, visibly furred with green-black mold, collapsing in on itself in a matter of seconds. The milk in the icebox, which she had opened for the guests' tea, had curdled into a solid, weeping block of cheese. Her tools of comfort were turning putrid, her domesticity inverted into a landscape of visceral horror. The floor was now a living carpet of insects, not just beetles, but things she couldn't name. Soft-bodied, multi-legged creatures that popped under her slippers with a wet, sickening sound. The locusts had found Eustace, covering him, but he didn't move, didn't brush them away. They crawled over his glasses into the cuffs of his shirt. Muriel, pushed past the breaking point, finally turned her terror into rage, her rage into blame. It was the only defense she had left. She stormed into the parlor, pointing a shaking finger at her husband. You did this. You let this happen. You never fix anything." This was the moment, the unveiling. Eustace, draped in a shroud of whispering insects, slowly turned his head. The motion was wrong. It was dry, like old leather stretching, accompanied by the sound of cracking twigs. His glasses, caked in dust and insect filth, fell from his face, shattering on the floor. His skin was not skin. It was dry, flaking parchment, the color of old corn husks, stretched tight over a stick-like frame. He had been a hollow thing for years. She just hadn't had the courage to see it. He was a scarecrow, animated by nothing but the land's cruel, mocking will. He opened his mouth to speak, to answer her accusation. But there was no voice. There was no him. Only a sound, like 1,000 dry leaves, and then a torrent. A black, writhing cascade of dried corn husks, dead locusts, and thick, choking dust poured from his mouth. It was the land emptying itself. It was the nowhere entity, showing her the puppet and the strings. The man she had served, loved, and lived with was gone, replaced by the earth's refuse. He was just another part of the property, another fixture in her prison, her mind fractured. The psychological break was clean and absolute. The man in the chair was a monster. The guest in the parlor was a monster. The house was the monster. She finally, truly understood. She looked at the shrouded figure of Ramses, and it was gone. It had never been the true threat. It was just a key, a catalyst, a grotesque delivery system for the real horror, which was the land itself. The land she was standing on, the land that held her house, the land that owned her, and the land that owned the hollowed-out thing that used to be her husband. She snapped. The only thought left was flee, not survival, but escape. It was a raw animal instinct. She grabbed the old keys to the rusted-out pickup truck from the hook by the door, the metal cold and foreign in her hand. She didn't bother with a coat, with her purse. She bolted, bursting through the screen door, the spring slamming it shut behind her with a sound like a gunshot. The nowhere entity let her go. It wanted her to run. The trap is so much more effective when the victim believes, for just one blissful, agonizing moment, that there is a way out. The truck, a relic of oxidized red metal, sat half sunk in the dirt. It shouldn't have worked. It hadn't been driven in years. But when she jammed the key in the ignition and turned, the engine roared to life with a violent coughing thunder. This was the false hope, the most cruel and precise instrument of psychological torture. The belief, however slim, that she could make it, that she could outrun the decay, outrun the animate corpse in her living room, outrun the very ground beneath her. She slammed the truck into gear, tires spinning in the mud, and fish-tailed onto the long, straight dirt road that led away. She drove, her foot mashed to the floorboard. The dirt road stretched before her, a monochrome ribbon under the sickly, bleeding sunset. The sky was a bruised, impossible color, a swirl of reds and purples that offered no comfort, no sign of a world beyond. The oppressive sound of the wind returned, shrieking past the truck's cab, carrying those same distorted whispers. But now they sounded like they were laughing, egging her on, daring her to go faster. She kept her eyes forward, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her only prayer to see a different horizon. But the horizon never changed. It remained a perfectly straight, inescapable line. After what felt like an hour, she should have reached the highway. She should have seen other lights, other signs of life, but there was nothing, just the endless repeating dirt road. And then she saw it on the right, a peculiar three-pronged dead tree, its branches like skeletal fingers. She stared at it, a cold dread creeping up her spine, a dread colder than the one Ramses had brought. She drove for another 20 minutes, her heart pounding, only to see the same exact three-pronged tree. The landscape was a lie. The road was not a road. It was a loop, a fractal, an intestine folding in on itself. The nowhere entity was not a place. It was a conscious, malevolent geometry, and it was playing with her. She pushed the engine, the whining sound a human scream, her own screams lost inside it. She watched the gas gauge. It was full. It had been full when she started, and it remained full now. The truck was being fed just as she was, kept alive just enough to continue the torment. The land was the entire world, and the world was a cage. She drove for hours. The sun did not set. The sickly, reddish light remained constant, frying her nerves, baking her mind. The sameness of the road, the repeating tree, the unmoving horizon, it became a form of sensory deprivation. Her sanity, already fractured, began to dissolve. She was no longer driving from something, she was just driving. She was a rat in a wheel, and the land was watching, amused. The realization that there was no escape, that the concept of escape was a joke, was a weight that finally crushed her. And then, as if the entity had grown bored with this particular game, the engine sputtered. It choked, coughed a plume of black smoke, and died. The sudden, absolute silence was a physical blow. The truck coasted to a stop in a cloud of its own dust. She sat there, unbreaking, the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. She was frozen. She didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what she already knew, but she did. She slowly, mechanically, turned her head and looked out the passenger window. She was right back in front of her own farmhouse. The truck had died in the exact same spot it had been parked. She hadn't moved an inch, or she had moved in a perfect, impossible circle and been returned to her starting point. It didn't matter. The result was the same. The false hope was not just crushed, it was eviscerated, held up as a mocking trophy. The nowhere entity had proven its point. There was no away. There was only here, and here was eternal. As she watched, paralyzed, the front door of the farmhouse, the one she had burst through in her panic, slowly creaked open. It swung inward on its hinges, revealing the dark, waiting maw of the hallway. It was an invitation, a silent, final, mocking welcome home. Come back, the darkness seemed to whisper. Come back to your prison. There was no one pulling the door. The house itself was inviting her in. It was time to return. It was time to accept her place. Her feet felt like lead as she stepped out of the truck. The ground beneath her seemed to sigh, a soft, welcoming exhalation of dust. Every step toward the porch was a defeat, and that's when she heard it, a low, terrified, whimpering sound from beneath the porch. A small, pink, shaking form huddled in the shadows. Courage, but it wasn't the brave, cartoonish protector of her fractured memories. It was just a mangy, terrified stray, its eyes wide with a terror she recognized as her own. It was a delusion, a psychological construct of her last sliver of sanity, and it was utterly, completely powerless. She saw the dog for what it truly was, a shared hallucination, a piece of her own broken mind she had projected onto the world, desperate for a protector, a witness. It was as real as her kindness. It was as real as her home. The creature whimpered again, a pathetic, thin sound, and scrambled deeper into the darkness, abandoning her. She was, as she had always been, truly alone. The last shred of her self-deception was gone, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the nowhere. She stopped on the bottom step, her hand on the railing. The wood was slick with the same black, fungal growth from the walls. She looked inside, and the true, final horror revealed itself. The house was clean, spotless. The insects were gone. The rot was gone. The water damage was gone. The wallpaper was pristine. Eustace was back in his chair, rocking gently, his newspaper held up in front of his face as if nothing had happened. The shrouded figure was gone. It was all back to normal. The entity had reset the board, proving it could. This was the ultimate gaslighting. It was this impossible normalcy that finally broke her. The grotesque horror was one thing. It could be fought, it could be fled. But this? A world where the nightmare could erase itself, could pretend it never happened, leaving her to hold the memory of it alone? That was madness. That was the true face of her prison. She was the one who was wrong, not the world. She was the one who was broken. She stepped inside, the floorboards welcoming her, the screen door shut behind her with a soft final click. And the television, the old boxy set in the corner, clicked on, not to a show, not to the news. It was pure, roaring static, a storm of black and white visual noise, but the static was not random. It began to swirl, to coalesce. It formed a shape, a leering, grinning, grotesque face, its features made of swirling, chaotic light and darkness, the spirit of the harvest moon. It had been waiting. It had been watching from the wires, from the airwaves. It spoke, and its voice was a terrible, distorted, mocking echo of her own. "It's time for a sacrifice, dearie," it sang. "What will you give me?" The face on the television grinned, a grotesque mask of swirling static and chaotic light, the harvest moon. It was not a spirit in the sky, but a parasite in the wires, a consciousness that lived in the dead air between stations. Its voice, a distorted, high-pitched mockery of her own, filled the unnervingly pristine room, vibrating in her teeth. "It's time, dearie," it sang, the sound a symphony of breaking glass and buzzing flies. "The land is hungry, the house is hungry, and I am starving." The face contorted in a silent, ecstatic laugh, its features running like ink. "I am offering you a choice," the static voice cooed, a blatant, terrible lie. "You can be consumed, given to the things below, the rot and the insects, a piece at a time, or you can join us." The grinning face gestured to the room, to Eustace, who sat rocking, his newspaper a brittle, yellowed shield. "You can become a permanent fixture, a part of the house, part of me. You can stay forever. Isn't that what you've always wanted? A home?" The static on the screen shifted, the roaring noise softening to a whisper. The grinning face was replaced by a vision, not a memory, but the idea of one, crafted from her deepest, most pathetic longings. It was a sunlit afternoon, her younger, her hair thick, baking an apple pie. The kitchen was warm, the air smelled of cinnamon and cloves, and at her feet a small pink, brave dog wagged its tail. A tear of impossible longing traced a line of filth down Muriel's cheek. It was everything she had pretended her life was. Just let go, the voice whispered, now warm, seductive, almost maternal. It's all right here. No more monsters, no more decay, just peace, just home. All you have to do is accept your place, Muriel. Let go of all this effort. Just be one of us. The vision pulsed, became more vibrant. The smell of the phantom apple pie wafted through the room, a sensory lie so potent it made her knees weak. This was the true temptation, not a threat, but a promise of release, to simply stop fighting and be absorbed. But as she watched the beautiful golden lie on the screen, her gaze drifted. It fell on the thing in the chair, Eustace, the hollow man, the dry, rustling scarecrow of sticks and leaves that she had poured her life into, a vessel that held nothing. She saw the delusion of courage still whimpering beneath the porch, a construct of her own weakness. She realized, in a flash of pure, agonizing clarity, that the happy life the entity offered was the same lie she had already been living. Her kindness, her home, it was all a cage she had helped build. And in that moment, something new was born inside her, something the nowhere-here entity had never anticipated. Not more fear, not denial. It was a cold, pure, and brittle rage. It was the final, desperate assertion of an identity she had almost forgotten she possessed. She would not be food for insects. She would not be a puppet, a hollowed-out fixture like her husband. She would not be erased by this indifferent, gluttonous place. She would not be a character in its cruel, repeating story. She chose neither. She chose the one thing the land could not have, the one thing it could not assimilate or digest. Absolute, total annihilation. This was her victory, the only one possible in a world where survival meant damnation. She would not be a part of the cycle. She would not be the prize. In her final terrible act, she would be the one who struck the match. She would not just leave the game, she would shatter the board. She remembered the barn. She remembered the old rusted kerosene tank, kept for a tractor that hadn't run in a decade, to farmland that grew nothing but dust and malice. She turned from the television, her movements no longer frail, but filled with a terrible, calm purpose. The static on the screen erupted into a furious, high-pitched shriek, the grinning face returning, its features contorted in disbelief, in fury. "No! You belong to me!" it screamed, the voice cracking the plaster on the walls. Muriel ignored it. She walked out the front door, the screen door slamming shut behind her. The land itself seemed to resist her, the wind rising to a physical barrier, pushing against her, tearing at her hair. The ground, usually so dry, felt soft and clutching, like mud, trying to suck her shoes from her feet. But she pushed forward, her eyes fixed on the dark, skeletal shape of the barn. She was no longer a victim. She was a ghost with one final earthly task. The barn was a coffin of shadows, the air thick with the smell of old dead hay, rust, and oil. And there it was, the red 10-gallon tank. It was heavy, almost too heavy, but her rage gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She dragged it, scraping a deep, angry line in the dirt, a final scar on the land that had scarred her. She dragged it all the way back to the house, the entity inside the television screaming a constant electronic wail of pure, impotent hatred. She started in the parlor. She unscrewed the cap, and the sharp, chemical smell was a perfume of liberation. She splashed the liquid over the pristine, lying wallpaper, watching it soak in, staining the roses brown. She poured it in a wide arc over the parlor rug, over the rocking chair, and over Eustace. The kerosene soaked into his dry, husked frame. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He was just a thing, waiting for the fire. She had served him in life. She would deliver him in death. She moved to the kitchen, her sanctuary, her cell. She doused the counters where she had baked her lies. She poured it into the pantry that had birthed the rot. She soaked the table where she had invited the curse for tea. She moved through the small house like a priestess, anointing every surface with the promise of its end. She was no longer a victim of the house's corruption. She was its author, its final cleansing fire. Finally, she stood on the front porch, the tank empty, clattering to the boards. With the last dregs, she anointed herself. She poured the kerosene over her own head, the cold liquid soaking her hair, her dress, the smell burning her nostrils. It was a final, terrible baptism, washing away the fear, the denial, the pathological kindness. She was no longer Muriel. She was a fuse. She reached into her apron pocket, her hand closing around Eustace's old box of wooden matches. The face on the television was just a frantic, screaming blur of static. The house itself seemed to be shaking, the nowhere entity finally, truly understanding what was about to happen. Muriel struck the match. The sound of it, the scrape of sulfur on the box, was the loudest sound she had ever heard. A single, clear note of defiance in a world of whispering, mocking lies. She held the tiny, perfect flame up. She looked at it, and for the first time in years, she smiled. She won. She tossed the match onto the soaked porch swing, and now you know the truth. The final image wasn't of a small pink dog. It was of the smoldering, charred black skeleton of a farmhouse at dawn, a rising plume of greasy smoke, the only thing to break the unnaturally straight horizon. The land was silent, scorched, but patient. As the camera pulled back, pulling away from the ruins, it revealed a new, identical farmhouse, perfectly whole, standing on the horizon just a mile away. A freshly painted "For Sale" sign was hammered into the dirt by the road. The trap is eternal. The nowhere entity is always ready for its next guests. And Muriel, her sacrifice bought her nothing but an ending. Her soul is just another whisper on the wind, forever trapped in the cycle, forever part of the land she tried to destroy.